Okay, hello. So we're gonna go through this book. It's called The Wright Brothers, Pioneers of American Aviation. And this is extra, but it kind of goes along with what we're reading in class. Okay, so if you remember, the Wright Brothers invented the first working airplane that could hold a person in it. And remember, they also approached President Teddy Roosevelt and made the first prototype for a military airplane. Okay, so the Air Force was essentially established because of the Wright brothers and them making airplanes possible to carry humans, as well as making the first military plane. Okay, so I'm going to start with Chapter 1, Learning from Mother. Susan Wright wasn't like other mothers. She was younger and prettier than most other mothers, and she liked to laugh and she liked to play games with her three youngest children, Wilbur, who was 11, Orville, who was 7, and Catherine, who was 4. The other mothers would shake their heads and say, "Susan Wright spoils those children, lets them do anything they want. No good will come of it." But Susan Wright only laughed. In the summer, she'd pack a picnic lunch, and she, the two boys, and little Kate, no one ever called her Catherine, would go and spend a day in the woods. Mrs. Wright knew the name of every bird, and she could tell a bird by his song. Wilbur and Orville learned to tell birds, too. One day, they sat on the banks of a river near Dayton, where they lived. Wilbur and Orville were fishing. Everyone called Wilbur Will, and of course, Orville was Orv. The fish weren't biting very well. Suddenly, a big bird swooped down, stuck its long bill into the river, came out with a tiny fish, and then swooped right up in the sky again. "What makes a bird fly, Mother?" Wilbur asked. "Their wings, Will," she said. "You notice they move their wings, and that makes them go faster." "But, Mother," Will said, not quite satisfied, "that bird that just swooped down didn't even move his wings. He swooped down, grabbed a fish, and then went right up again. He never moved his wings at all." "The wind doesn't just blow toward you or away from you," she said. "It blows up and down, too. When a current of air blows up, it takes the bird up. His wings support him in the air." "If we had wings, then we could fly too, couldn't we, Mother?" Wilbur asked. "But God didn't give us wings," she laughed. "Maybe we could make wings," Wilbur insisted. "Maybe," his mother said thoughtfully. "But I don't know. No one ever did make wings that would allow a boy to fly." "I will someday," Wilbur said, and Orville nodded and said, "I will too." "Well, when you're a little older, maybe you can try," their mother said. That was another thing about Susan Wright. Most other mothers would have thought that this was foolish talk. Most other mothers would have said, "Oh, don't be silly. Who ever heard of such nonsense?" But not Susan Wright. She knew that even an 11-year-old boy can have ideas of his own, and just because they happen to come from an 11-year-old head, well, that didn't make them foolish. She never treated her children as if they were babies, and perhaps that's why they liked to go fishing with her on picnics with her, and that's why they kept asking her questions. She always gave them sensible answers. They asked their father questions too, but he was a traveling minister and he was away a lot. "It's getting chilly," Mrs. Wright said suddenly. "Look at those gray clouds, Will." Wilbur looked up. "It's going to snow, I bet," he said happily. "No more picnics until next spring," his mother said. "Yes, it looks like snow. We'd better be getting home." As they reached home, the first big white snowflakes started to fall. They kept falling all that night and all the next day. It was the first real snowstorm of the year. In the morning, the wind was blowing so fiercely that Wilbur found it hard to walk to the barn where the wood was stored. The wind was so strong it almost knocked him down, and he burst through the kitchen door with an armful of wood for the stove, and he told his mother about the wind. "The thing to do is to lean forward into the wind," she said. "Bend over, and that way you get closer to the ground and you get under the wind." That night when Wilbur had to make the trip for more wood, he tried his mother's idea. To his surprise, it worked. When he was bent over, the wind didn't seem nearly so strong. After a few days, the wind stopped, and now the whole countryside was covered with snow. Wilbur and Orville, with little Kate trailing behind, hurried to the big hill not far from the house. Orville's schoolmates were all there with their sleds. It was a good hill to coast down because no roads came anywhere near it, and even if they had, it wouldn't have mattered. This was 1878, and there were no automobiles. Horse-drawn sleighs traveled the roads in winter. The horses had bells fastened to their collars. As they jogged along, the bells rang, and you could hear them a mile away. Most of the boys had their own sleds, not the kind that boys have now, but old-fashioned sleds with 2 wooden runners. No one ever thought of owning a bought sled. In those days, a boy's father made a sled for him. The boys who had sleds of their own let Wilbur and Orville ride down the hill with them. Ed Sines and Chauncey Smith and John Morrow and Al Johnston all owned sleds, but they liked to race one another down the long hill. When this happened, Wilbur and Orville just had to stand there and watch. Late that afternoon, the boys came home, with Kate behind them, and their mother noticed that they were very quiet. She soon found out why they were unhappy. "Why doesn't Father build us a sled?" Wilbur blurted out. "But Father is away, Will," his mother said gently, "and you know how busy he is when he is at home. He has to write stories for the church paper, and he has to write sermons. Now suppose we build a sled together." Wilbur laughed. "Who ever heard of anyone's mother building a sled?" "You just wait," his mother said. "We'll build a better sled than Ed Sines has. Now give me a pencil and a piece of paper." "You going to build a sled out of paper?" Orville asked in amazement. "Just wait," she repeated. Chapter 2, Get It Right on Paper. Will and Orv brought their mother a pencil and paper, and she went to the minister's desk and found a ruler. Then she sat down at the kitchen table. "First, we'll draw a picture of the sled," she said. "What good is a picture of a sled?" Orville asked. "Now, Orville, watch Mother." She picked up the ruler in one hand and the pencil in the other. "We want one like Ed Sines has," Orville said. "When you go coasting, how many boys will Ed Sines' sled hold?" she asked. "2," Wilbur said. "We'll make this one big enough to hold 3, she said. "Maybe you can take Kate along sometimes." The outline of a sled began to appear on the paper. As she drew it, she talked. "You see, Ed's sled is about 4 feet long. I've seen it often enough. We'll make this one 5 feet long. Now, Ed's sled is about 1 foot off the ground, isn't it?" Orville nodded, his eyes never leaving the drawing that was taking shape. It was beginning to look like a sled now, but not like the sleds the other boys had. "You've made it too low," Will said. "You want a sled that's faster than Ed's sled, don't you?" His mother smiled. "Well, Ed's sled is at least 1 foot high. Our sled will be lower, closer to the ground, and it won't meet so much wind resistance." Wind resistance? It was the first time Wilbur had ever heard the expression. He looked blankly at his mother. "Remember the blizzard last week?" she asked. "Remember when you went out to the woodshed and the wind was so strong you could hardly walk to the shed? I told you to lean over, and on the next trip to the woodshed you did. When you came back with an armful of wood, you laughed and said, 'Mother, I leaned way forward and got under the wind.' You were closer to the ground and you were able to lessen the wind resistance. Now, the closer to the ground our sled is, the less wind resistance there will be, and the faster it will go." "Wind resistance. Wind resistance," Wilbur repeated, and maybe the airplane was born in that moment. Certainly neither Will nor Orville Wright ever forgot that first lesson in speed. "How do you know about these things, Mother?" Wilbur asked. "You'd be surprised how much mothers know, Will," she laughed. She didn't tell the boys that when she was a little girl at school, her best subject had been arithmetic. It just came naturally to her. It was the same when she went to high school, and when she went to college, algebra and geometry were her best subjects. That was why she knew all about things like wind resistance. Finally, she finished the drawing. The boys leaned over the table to look at it. This sled was going to be longer than Ed's sled, and much narrower. Ed's sled was about 3 feet wide. This one looked as if it would be only half that wide. "You made it narrow," Wilbur said shrewdly, "to make it faster. The narrower it is, the less wind resistance." "That's right," his mother nodded. "Now let's put down the exact length of the runners and the exact width of the sled." "But that's only a paper sled," Orville protested. "If you get it right on paper," she said calmly, "it'll be right when you build it. Always remember that." "If you get it right on paper, it'll be right when you build it," Wilbur repeated, and his mother looked at him sharply. Sometimes Will seemed older than his 11 years. Little Orville was quick to give you an answer to anything, but as often as not, he'd forget the answer right away. When Will learned something, he never forgot it. "Mother, you make all your clothes," Wilbur said thoughtfully. "You always make a drawing first." "We call that a pattern," his mother said. "I draw and then cut on a pattern. That's exactly the size of the dress I'm going to make. And if the pattern is right, it'll be right when you make the dress," he finished. And she nodded. "Now, you 2 boys get started on your sled," she smiled. "There are plenty of planks out in the barn. Find the very lightest ones. Don't use planks with knots in them. You sawed the planks on the right side. Will, don't let Orville touch the saw." "May we use Father's tools?" Wilbur asked breathlessly. His mother nodded. "I don't think your father will mind. I know you'll be careful with them. Just follow the drawing exactly," she warned once more. The 2 boys and Kate hurried out to the barn. They realized that this was an important occasion. Wilbur always chopped the wood for the stove when his father was away, but he had never been allowed to use the gleaming tools that lay in his father's tool chest. 3 days later, the sled was finished. They pulled it out of the barn and asked their mother to inspect it. She had her tape measure with her, and she measured it. The runners were exactly the length she had put down in her drawing. In fact, the boys had followed every direction she had given them. The runners gleamed. Orville had polished them with sandpaper until they were as smooth as silk. "We thought of one other thing, Mother," Will said. "We found some old candles in the woodshed, and we rubbed the runners with the candles. See how smooth they are?" Mrs. Wright nodded. She had forgotten to tell the boys that, but they'd thought it out for themselves. "Now try your sled," she told them. Followed by Kate, the boys dragged their new sled to the hill only half a mile away where their pals were coasting. They looked at the new sled in amazement. It was long and very narrow. It looked as though it wouldn't hold anyone. The runners were thin compared to those on their own sleds. "Who made that for you?" Ed Sines asked. "Mother showed us how," Wilbur said proudly. Some of the boys laughed. Who ever heard of a boy's mother knowing how to make a sled? "It looks as if it would fall apart if you sat on it," Al Johnston said, and he laughed too. "Come on, we'll race you down the hill," another cried out. "All right, 2 on each sled," Wilbur said. He wasn't a bit afraid. He was sure the drawing had been right, and because he and Orv had followed the drawing, he knew that the sled was right. They lined the 4 sleds up. Will and Orv sat on their sled, but it didn't fall apart. Suddenly, Wilbur got an idea. "Get up, Orv," he said. "Now lie down on the sled. That's it. Spread your legs a bit." Will then flopped down on top of his brother. "Less wind resistance this way," he whispered. "Give us all a push," Ed Sines yelled, and then they were off. It was an even start. The 4 sleds gathered speed, for at the top of the slope was steep. Will looked to the right and then to the left, and he brushed the stinging snow out of his eyes, but he couldn't see the other sleds. He looked behind. They were straggling along 20 and now 30 feet in back of him. The new sled skimmed along, the runners singing happily. Both Will and Orv felt a strange thrill of excitement. They approached the bottom of the hill. The other sleds were far, far behind now. Usually, when the sleds reached the bottom of the hill, they slowed down abruptly and stopped. But not this sled. It kept on. It kept on. Its momentum carried it on 100 yards farther than any of the other sleds had ever reached. And finally it stopped. Shaking with excitement, Will and Orv stood up. "We flew down the hill, Orv," Will said breathlessly. "We flew," Orv repeated. Now Ed and Al and Johnny ran up excited at what had happened. No sled had gone so far, so fast as the one as Will and Orv had built. "You flew down the hill," Ed Sines gasped. "Let me try it." Wilbur looked at Orv, and some secret message seemed to pass between them. They had built this sled together, and it was the best sled there was. They'd always worked together building things. "Orv," Will said, "I've got an idea. This sled can do everything but steer. Maybe we can make a rudder for it. Then we can make it go to the right or to the left." We'll get Mother to draw one," Orv said. "We'll draw one, you and I," Wilbur said. "We can't run to Mother every time we want to make something." By now, little Kate had come running down the hill. "You promised," she panted. "You said you'd take me for a ride." "Come on, Kate," Will laughed. "The 3 of us will coast down once, and then you can try it, Ed." They trudged up the hill, pulling the sled. 2 words kept singing in Wilbur's ears. "We flew, we flew, we flew." Okay, well, that's the end of chapter 2, and we will continue on in the next video. Bye.